Jorge Luis Borges' short story, The Theologians, turns on a number of dualities or contrasts between two things, some of which have to do with people, some of which have to do with heresies, woven into the heresies, contrasts of one heresy against another. And it's a story, we could say a legendary production on Borges's part of what might be going on within the mind, at least of one person, that is Aurelian. We don't really know what's going on except a little bit in the mind of his rival, the one who he's actually supposed to be a brother to in some respects, but views as almost like an enemy, John of Pannonia, who are both opposed as Orthodox Christians to various types of heresy. So it begins by talking about the rise of one particular heresy, and it's kind of a cool story that gets told here that might make you think about what would it be like if something similar to this happened in other venues with other books. So it says, the gardens ravaged, the altars and chalices profaned. The Huns rode their horses into the monastery library and mangled the incomprehensible books and reviled and burned them. Fearful perhaps the letters of the books might harbor blasphemies against their God, who is a scimitar of iron. They burned palimpsests and codices. But in the heart of this bonfire, among the ashes, there lay, virtually untouched by the flames, the 12th book of the Civitas Dei, the City of God, which says that in Athens, Plato once taught that at the end of time, all things will return again to where they once were, that he in Athens, before the same circle of listeners, will one day teach that doctrine once again. The text spared by the flames came to enjoy a special veneration. Those who read and reread it in that remote province came to forget that the author put forth the doctrine only in order more roundly to refute it. Now, that's going to be kind of a theme in this story showing up a little bit later, but we could think about what would it be like to have just the leavings, the residue of some important works. And we don't know their context at all. And we don't know that the author is writing something not in order to endorse it, but in order to criticize and to attack this other thing. You might think about a Platonic dialogue, for example, where Socrates will often say, somebody might have this sort of position, but that would be wrong because of this. What if we lost all of but that would be wrong because of this? Then we would think that was actually Socrates' own position. So context matters, we could say. And that's going to become an important point later on when we see what happens to John of Pannonia. So from this, a heresy arises. A heresy is a way of going astray from the true faith. It actually comes from the Greek word heresis originally, which was used for adopting a certain way of life. So philosophical schools were actually called hereses in ancient Greek. And then in the Christian context, it comes to mean those who deviate from orthodoxy in some determinate way. So what did they do? 100 years later, Aurelian, bishop coadjutor of Aquileia, learned that on the banks of the Danube, the newborn sect, who are called two things, monotoni or anulari, arise. And what are they claiming? History is a circle. So not just time is a circle, history, what includes human beings, is a circle. All things that have existed before and will exist again. And so in the mountains, the wheel and the serpent supplanted the cross. And he hears that John of Pannonia is going to be writing a treatise to combat this heresy. That's not good news for Aurelian. Why? He deplored the entire situation. He knew that in theology there's no novelty without danger. Then he reflected that the notion of circular time was too strange, too shocking for the danger to be very serious. The heresies we ought to fear are those that can be confused with orthodoxy. So again, kind of an important little foreshadowing there. And why is Aurelian bothered by the fact that John is going to write this? Well, they are rivals. So Aurelian really wants to surpass John of Pannonia. Why? Because 2 years before John's verbose treatise De Septima Affectione Dei Cividet Eternitate had trespassed on Aurelian's old field of expertise. Now, as if the problem of time were his alone, John promised to set the Anulari right, no doubt with arguments befitting Procrustes and remedies more terrible than the servant itself. So Aurelian is thinking, the arguments aren't going to be that great, and John is going to, be not staying in his own lane, as we say, but veering off into my territory. So he then is reading Plutarch, and there's an interesting reference here to the very problem. And we've got this interesting remark by Borges. Those who seek the love of a woman in order to stop thinking of her, to put her out of their mind, similarly, Aurelian wanted to outstrip John of Pannonia, not because he wished to do him any harm, but in order to cure himself of the grudge he held for the man. This could actually be looked at as a properly Christian motive, since I can't help but hold a grudge and feel envy towards this person. If I can show myself superior to him, well, then I won't be feeling that, and that will be a good thing. So what does he do? He writes a very complex piece here. His temper cooled by the crafting of syllogisms and the invention of contumely, by the negos and outums and nequaquams, the rancor dropped away. He constructed vast labyrinthine paragraphs, we could say, made impassable by the piling up of clauses on clauses. He crafted an instrument from cacophony. He foresaw John would thunder down on the Anulari with the gravity of a prophet. Aurelian decided to come at the problem from a different tack. He chose derision. Now, it doesn't turn out quite that way. So there's a number of different references that Borges gives here, which we don't need to actually go over because you can just read them in the story. But we find out that it took Aurelian 9 days to compose his treatise. On the 10th, he receives a copy of the refutation by John of Pannonia. And John's refutation is better. Why? It was almost ludicrously brief, right? What does it do? It glosses the closing verses of the 9th chapter of the Epistle to the Hebrews, which say, Jesus has not suffered many times since the foundation of the world, but has been sacrificed now, once, in the end of the world. The second section cited the biblical injunction concerning vain repetitions of the heathens, and that passage from the 7th work of Pliny, which praises the fact that in all the wide universe, there are no two faces that are the same. John of Pannonia declared no two souls were the same either, and that the basest sinner is as precious as the blood shed for him by Jesus Christ. The act of a single man, he said, weighs more than the 9 concentric heavens, and to think erroneously it can be lost and return again is naught but spectacular foolishness. Time does not restore what we lose. Eternity holds it for glory and also for the fire, for hell. John's treatise was limpid, universal. It seemed written not by a particular person, but by any man, perhaps by all men. So it is clearly a superior work, and Aurelian feels humiliated as a result of this. John has not only strayed into Aurelian's territory for the second time, he has shown him up. And he thinks, oh, what should I do with my treatise? Should I get rid of it? And he then decides, no, I need to send it off to Rome. I won't even rework it. And whose treatise gets chosen to be the refutation? John's treatise. And this continues what Borges here is calling a secret battle between John and Aurelian. They were the two men were soldiers in the same army, strove for the same prize, fought against the same enemy, yet Aurelian wrote not a word that was not aimed, however unconfessably, at besting John. Their duel was an invisible one. And here Borges talks about reading through means patrologia. So the reference there is to this vast compendium of Greek and Latin works of Christian writers that Mean and a number of other people put together. And he says, in this corpus, not once does the other man's name figure in the many volumes of Aurelian's works collected therein for posterity, and John's works, only 20 words have survived. Now, why is that the case? Well, that's when we get to the second heresy. So we find out that a new problem arises, perhaps in Egypt or in Asia. It's a sect that soon infested the eastern provinces, and it seemed to be everywhere. Crucifixes had been turned upside down. The image of the Lord had been supplanted by a mirror. The mirror and the obelisk were the emblems of these new schismatics. And he says, history knows them by many names. Well, what are they? The histriani, the speculari, the abysmali, the kainitai. And he even goes on to say that that in Phrygia they were called the simulacra, and in Dardania as well, John of Damascus, a different John, called them forms, and says, well, we're not quite sure if that was actually correct. So what are they about? They're not about a circular time that can be represented by a serpent or a wheel. Instead, they begin with asceticism, that is like bodily discipline, going without things. And then from mortification and severity, they sometimes graduated to crime. Certain communities tolerated theft. Others, homicide. Others, sodomy, incest, and bestiality. Why? Well, we'll see their justification in a moment. All were blasphemous. They cursed not only the Christian God, but even the arcane deities of their own pantheon. They plotted together to write sacred texts. Well, why? What's going on? What's motivating them? So he says, in the Hermetic books, it's written that things below are as things above, and things above as things below. The Zohar tells us the lower world is a reflection of the higher. The Histriani founded their doctrine on a perversion of this idea. They invoked Matthew, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, to prove that earth influences heaven. They cited Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, for now we see through a glass darkly, to prove all things we see are false. Contaminated perhaps by the monotony, they imagined that every man is two men, and the real one is the other one, so that if the one in heaven. They also imagined our acts cast an inverted reflection, so if we are awake, the other man is asleep. This is why the mirror is an important symbol for them. Now, if you follow that logic, the things you do here could make that other, more real man better. How so? Well, if we fornicate, the other man is chaste. If we steal, the other man is generous. When we die, they believed we shall join him and be him. So, by engaging in crime and blasphemy and all these other bad things, they are preparing the way to rejoin the real person that is them up in heaven. Other histriani believed other things. The world would end when the number of its possibilities was exhausted. Since there can be no repetitions, the righteous are duty-bound to eliminate or commit the most abominable acts, so those acts will not sully the future, and the coming of the kingdom of Jesus may be hastened. That particular article of faith was denied by other sects, who rejoined that the history of the world must be acted out in every man. And it goes on talking about, transmigrations and all of that. They also said that not to be an evildoer was an act of satanic arrogance. The Histrioni wove many and diverse mythologies. Some preached asceticism, others license, all confusion, right? So these numerous doctrines are problematic and heretical. We find out that the heretics in Aurelian's diocese were not those who claimed every act is reflected in heaven, but those who claimed time does not tolerate repetitions. So, this is going to be fateful for John. Why? Because in order to refute them, Aurelian is going to use a phrase, and he's not sure where it comes from at first, and then he realizes, as Borges says, he has actually plagiarized his rival. A sentence of 20 words came to his spirit. With joy, he wrote it on the page. Immediately afterwards, he was disturbed by the sense it was somebody else's. The next day, he remembered. He had read it many years ago in the Adversus Annularis, when John refuted the Annulari. He ferreted out the quotation. There it was. So what should he do then? He couldn't simply alter or omit the words, but to let them stand was to plagiarize a man he detested. To indicate the source was to denounce him, to say that he, John of Pannonia, was falling into heresy. So he prays, he pleads for divine aid. His guardian angel suggested a middle way. Aurelian kept the words, but that set this disclaimer before it: that which the heresiarchs howl today to the confusion of the faith was said during this century with more levity than blameworthiness by a most learned doctor of the church. So he's saying, when John said it, it was joking around. It was not really committing to it. These people are saying it in a different context. Then the church says, okay, who's this learned doctor? And Aurelian has to say, I'm afraid it's John. And a crisis then leads up to John's trial. A blacksmith, driven to delusions by the misrepresentations of the Histrioni, set a great iron ball upon the shoulders of his little son so that the child's double might fly. The man's child died. The horror of the crime obliged John's judges to be severe with him. The accused would not retract. Now, why would John not retract? Because, as he says, this was what I wrote, an important part of the refutation of the Annulari, and you cannot go back on that without, in some way, approving the Annulari. You can't say you've got that wrong without making them, in a certain way, right. Now, what we find out from Borges is that John didn't realize that to speak of the monotony or the Annulari was to speak of a thing now forgotten, and John screws himself over by being competent and being derisitory, doing this faux pas with genius and sarcasm. In a debate that lasts 3 days and 3 nights, he is condemned to be burned at the stake. Aurelian, we find out, witnesses John's execution. Why? Because to avoid it would have been to confess himself responsible for it. And it doesn't go well. John goes insane before it, apparently, as we read, laying with his face in the dust, howling like a beast, clawing at the ground. He's stripped and tied to his stake. They put a crown of straw sprinkled with sulfur and a copy of his refutation, the now pestilential Adversus Annularis. Because it rained the night before, the wood is kind of wet, and it takes him a while to die. And as that happens, we read, Aurelian saw for the first and last time the face of the man he hated. It reminded him of someone, but he couldn't quite remember whom. So then there's some other interesting references. Plutarch reports Julius Caesar wept at the death of Pompey. Aurelian did not weep at the death of John, but he did feel what a man cured of an incurable disease that had become part of his life might feel. He wanders from place to place, and then he himself will die in a fire as an old man. And then we get to the last paragraph, where Borges tells us the end of the story can only be told in metaphors. Why? Because it takes place in the kingdom of heaven, where time does not exist. Now let's pause on that for a moment. So these two heresies both have to do with time. What gets John in trouble is refuting the heresy of a circular time by saying that there can be no repetitions, which is unfortunately what some of the histrioni are saying, and John is condemned. So if in the kingdom of heaven time doesn't actually exist, John was then killed for something that kind of didn't matter, right? So we get two interesting speculations here on Borges' part. One might say that Aurelian spoke with God and found that God takes so little interest in religious differences that God mistook him for John of Pannonia. And then Borges says, well, that would be to impute confusion to the divine intelligence. We won't do that, right? But he's going to do something deeper and different. It's more correct to say that in paradise, Aurelian discovered that in the eyes of the unfathomable deity, he and John of Pannonia were a single person, which would seem similar to what it was that some of the histrioni were preaching. But two men who existed on earth and are now in paradise or heaven in the kingdom of God, they are the same person. And Borges is going to give us a bunch of qualifiers here. The orthodox and the heretic. Well, which of them is actually orthodox? John would seem to be orthodox, but he's condemned for heresy. Aurelian is unfortunately part of that condemnation. They're both orthodox, in a way. The abominator and the abominated. Aurelian is the abominator, John is the abominated. Except insofar as that John has abominated the monotony, the accuser and the victim. They're all the same person. Are they the same person in their own eyes? John is talking, or Aurelian is talking with God. So presumably he thinks that he's a different person, but he's finding out from God that he actually is the same as John. And that's where the story ends, with this sort of collapse. It's kind of an unsatisfactory ending, isn't it? Because it opens up other questions along the way and suggests that the entire perspective throughout the story has been, if not just a completely wrong or false one, at least partial one that we're used to thinking in terms of, though. John and Aurelian and the various heretics are different people, are they not? So this is where the story ends, with these questions left open.